Appalachia, a word that evokes a whole passel of reactions. Everything from the beauty of a mountaintop to trailer parks, drugs, and about everything in between. The Appalachian Mountains are indeed the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch from eastern Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. The folks that live in these mountains have faced an unending number of tragic and just plain odd happenings that cry out for the telling. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in these very mountains by family who themselves were born, raised, and lived for generations in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Come with me, and we'll take a look at some of the unending stories that come from within my beloved mountains. And we'll look through the eyes of an Appalachian at some outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 5 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. Hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Now, as you notice, there's going to be a little bit of a difference in the setup today. Couldn't get upstairs to the normal studio to do things the normal way because I got a knee injury, but, and yes, it did come from digging a ditch. You got it right. But anyway, we're going to go with something different today and see how it works out. This is sometimes how you find out things that you didn't know before. So, we'll see how it works for me anyway. Well, when we watch all these movies where somebody walks up behind somebody else and slaps a rag over their nose and mouth, causing said person to fade into unconsciousness, we've all seen enough to know that they must be using chloroform to disable somebody for some no-good purposes. I'm always thinking something along the lines of, I wonder if there's a deviant out there somewhere watching and thinking, man, I need to get my hands on some of that stuff. It'd sure make my job of raining terror on everybody a whole lot more easy. Well, it just happens that there existed at least one nutball, and with the advent of the internet making it as easy as me cutting a big swath of Miss Bentley's famous fall pie to make the stuff, you can bet your sweet bippy that they took their demon mix right out and tried it out on somebody. That would be why I'm here today. So sit on down there and make yourself to home, and let me tell you all about how that worked out for 'em. Now, this all happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, where if you ain't never been, might I suggest you take time and go because you don't know what you're missing. When you're on I-64 along Afton Mountain there, you think you're in heaven looking over the side of the mountains and in through the mountains back in the distance. It's just beautiful. But back in 2004, a man named Michael Ayers, who lived there in Charlottesville, just finished riding himself a wave of bad luck. Now, you might more accurately say that it wasn't actually luck, but something that he brought on himself by being involved in a series of burglaries, which led him to being caught and locked up in the pokey for about 10 years for his trouble. Now, while he was sitting there staring at the wall, he decided that, once he got out, he was going to turn his life around, or at least give every bit of effort he could into it anyway. Now, he worked hard to build back his finances, which was pretty admirable considering you lose everything when you get took to the lockup, and they don't make it easy once you get out. Michael actually started working to get straightened out while he was still locked up and managed to get pretty good shape there while he was still in prison before he was ever released. Now, after he got out, he started working out at a local gym a few times a week. That's where he was lucky enough to stumble across a man named Kurt Crobath. Now, Kurt was in a completely different situation than Michael, of course. Now, Kurt was 49 years old, and he'd been about as successful as it gets in his field of work. Now, he'd even been to school and got a stack of degrees, including a master's of business administration. And he'd got one of them from Columbia University. Of course, that would all be, without being all mellow and worldly, what would it all be? And so Kurt was known to be just that. He lived and been in about everywhere in the world, I guess, that in his mind he thought was worth being. He even spoke French and Arabic so good that the folks living in those areas didn't even know he was actually American. He was married with 2 sons, a successful financial consultant, who specialized in mergers and acquisitions. Now, that type of business, I remember, used to rub folks the wrong way when it first started out, but as it got a little more common, it just became a normal way of doing business in the modern world. And when you got as much knowledge as Kurt did, it seemed a shame to keep it all bottled up in his own mind without sharing it with everybody else. So he wrote articles in several different publications where he spread his knowledge among the less fortunate, as he might say, and he'd even hire himself out as an expert witness in court cases. Now, I reckon so folks could be regaled at his importance. Kind of sounds like one of them guys that, when folks go the other way when they see him coming, don't it? Uh, the ones that could piss off a whole room full of folks just by walking in. Don't even have to say nothing, just walk in and everybody's instantly mad. Kurt and his wife owned 2 houses at the time, and we'll get into why in a bit. Of course, that meant that he had 2 sets of neighbors in my book that he could drive nuts. But they owned a big house in Albemarle County just outside Charlottesville, which was a 5,000 square foot, 6-bedroom, 5-bath home sitting on about 5 acres of land. Now, it was worth over $750,000 back in the day. I reckon that was pretty good for a man making around $200,000 a year. From the sound of things, I was thinking it was probably making a good bit more than that. Now, everybody knew Kurt, thought that he was a pretty smart feller. Back in 1991, he even managed to get picked to go on the Jeopardy. Now, he took off like a shot on the program and did pretty good. Unfortunately for him, he was up against a lady named India Cooper, who made herself a 5-time champion that very night. So Kurt went home with a little over $12,000, which ain't too bad, and he managed not to make anybody mad in the process. Anyway, after he met Kurt, Michael Ayers managed to get into a car wreck in the spring of 2004. Now, he only received a few small cuts and bruises, but the cost of something like that happening to him right when he needed it less to happen left him without a car, and it hit his finances pretty hard too. Once you're in a crash like that, they're going to take you to the ER and give you all kind of tests, x-rays and all to make sure you're okay before they let you go. And that stuff ain't cheap, even with insurance, folks. So he just happened to mention all of that to his new friend Kurt one day while they was working out in the gym. Now, because I reckon Kurt hadn't done anything maybe to piss Michael off. Well, yeah, anyway. Once he finished up the story, he was downright shocked at how interested in the whole thing Kurt was. Kurt got all sympathetic up and said that he wanted to help. Michael was plumb tickled that he had a friend that wanted to, and I guess was able to help. Kurt went out and bought toys and clothes for Michael's son, who Michael had been supporting even before he got out of prison, which ain't easy to do from behind bars, folks. Kurt even insisted on paying some of Michael's bills. And to ice the cake, Kurt went out and bought Michael a used Audi to replace the car he'd lost in the wreck. At that point, I'd be wondering just what this Kurt feller was going to want in return. Aside from the fact that at this point, too, I'd be going back to look at my old car for sabotage. But all his friends said that, that was just the way old Kurt was. He always been a helpful person and helped people in need. It wasn't long after that that Kurt, and we say allegedly here because last thing you need to see is your Appalachian podfather walking around on TV in the middle of a lawsuit refusing to answer questions while a lawyer does all the talking for him. But anyway, Kurt allegedly told Michael that he had an opportunity for him to earn a quick $10,000. Of course, Michael was interested in that. $10,000 would go a long way in helping him get back even on the debt scale. At least Michael was interested until Kurt explained that all Michael had to do was off somebody for him. That's where I imagine Michael's interest turned to shock. Kurt said that he'd give Michael everything that he'd need to pull it off, up to and including instructions, what he'd done drawn out on an outline form with complete bullet points and all on how to do it without getting caught. Because I reckon he sat down in his computer-aided drafting program and worked it all out ahead of time. Now, when Kurt told him something like, the person that he wanted to erase from the gene pool was his old ball and chain of a wife, Jane, who just didn't seem to want to play ball in the marriage anymore. Now, I reckon play ball, meaning do exactly what Kurt said, only what Kurt said, and nothing but what Kurt said. Now, by then, Kurt and Jane had two boys and were 13 and 14. Jane was a stay-at-home mom who was highly involved in supporting autistic children. I reckon that must warrant a death sentence in Kurt's book. But they lived in California when they got married, but once they moved to Charlottesville in the 1990s, it was into the dream house that they built on that 5-acre property we were talking about. Now, to everybody outside looking in, they had a dream life, a dream children, all living in a big dream house. But while we were all sitting in front of our computers, wondering what was fixing to happen when the year clicked over from 1999 to 2000, supposedly the Crubbs realized that their marriage was stuck in a passion vacuum because there wasn't a scrap of it to be found between them, and things needed to change. So, by 2001, the story goes that with Kurt being the problem-solving kind of guy that he was and all, he came up with a fix that would take care of their dead, lifeless relationship, as he thought. And the way he saw it was that the old fire could be restoked between them by becoming swingers. Yes, folks, I agree. That's exactly the wrong thing to do, but that's what old Kurt suggested. Now, according to Kurt, each one of them would, on their own, just go right out and find somebody besides each other to get plum tree climbing, wall knocking jiggy with. Now, apparently, Kurt thought that an open relationship would rekindle the fire and bring back that old passion to their marriage. Remember, folks, this is a man with a stack of degrees thicker than an old Sears and Roebuck catalog that we used to get in the mail. Kurt hadn't bit more and brought it up than he was already on the prowl. From what I read, he was a regular on the internet dating sites and wasn't shy about telling everybody he was married on top of it. Wasn't long, too, before that load of manure developed a hitch in the get-along, and who would have thought that would happen? But the first problem being that Jane, like most human beings, just wasn't cut out to be a swinger, what with being a mother of two children and all. Then there was Kurt, who'd, in his own words, done fell in love with one of the women he met online, which led to the end of 2002 when Kurt and Jane decided to separate. And being that Kurt was the one moving out, he was going to get Jane to go together with him and buy him a new house, actually, that he could live in, which was about 4 miles away from the original house. So the poor woman was on the hook for his house that he needs in order to be able to live out his bachelor lifestyle while still being married. About a year after starting to live separately, Kurt and Jane, well, they started talking about maybe getting back together. Apparently, Jane still loved Kurt. The only problem with that was that Kurt did too. He loved himself a whole lot more than anybody else did, in fact. The fact was that he had been having his cake and eating it too so long that he wasn't about to let any of that go. So, Jane, being tired of beating her head against the rock, decided to file for divorce. That's when all of Kurt's sugar turned to shit because Jane had primary custody of the boys for the time being. Kurt was allowed to have the boys with him pretty often, in fact, because Jane was probably being too nice to the Nimrod. One point that set Kurt off like a firework was Jane's insistence that Kurt not have his girlfriend around when the boys came to his house to visit. Of course, ain't nobody going to tell Kurt what to do, so that went well. In the summer of 2004, a judge ordered Kurt to pay over $6,000 a month to Jane in various types of support. And that, folks, is the cost of having your cake and eating it too. Kurt was just exactly what you think he'd be, which was romping, stomping, rip somebody's head off, and jump down their neck mad once he found out that Jane would be getting more than of his income than he would, which is, of course, after taxes. Now, they come first. The divorce was set to be final on November 6th, and the judge didn't care whether Kurt liked it or not when he signed it into a court order. Now, once Kurt, the genius, did and redid the math on the upcoming unnuptials and hit the equal button on his scientific calculator, he realized as of November 6th, life as he knew it was over. with a capital O. Now, he was fixing to lose half everything he had, be forced to pay out the nose and various types of support to Jane every month from now on. And Jane was getting permanent primary custody of the boys, too. Of course, Kurt apparently thought that he deserved better than a one-room efficiency apartment that he saw dancing in his head in his near future. Before long, Kurt did a whole other type of math problem and came to the conclusion that Jane had to be cold and in the ground before the divorce was finalized. Now, that was all happening at the time he became friends with Michael Ayers and started buttering him up with all the gifts and financial aid. But once he worked his way into Michael's life like a copperhead, where he thought that there was no way in the world that the man could say no, he made Michael the $10,000 easy money offer. Now, Michael may have done some things in his past that he regretted and was trying to fix, but he didn't want to go back now. He told Kurt that he would do just about anything for him because he was a good friend and he'd helped him out so much, but he wasn't fixing to commit murder for any amount of money or for anybody. Michael wasn't sure at first if Kurt was even serious. Now, he changed his mind when he found out that from another friend that he'd got an offer from Kurt, too, to murder Jane. Now, it goes without saying that Kurt felt like Michael turned his back on him when he needed him the most. Now, especially with all he'd done for Michael. He thought Michael was just an ungrateful SOB. With summer turning to winter, Kurt went into the police station and accused Michael of stealing the car that he gave him. Kurt told police that Michael kept calling and harassing him, and all he wanted to do was get his car back, which Michael refused to do. Officer Waffle, who had been a policeman for over 30 years, figured it was just a scuffle between two friends, and more of that than it was an actual crime. So he decided to try to work a resolution out between the two parties. Once a report was filed, for some reason there was no further action taken at the time. Being that none of that worked out for Kurt, he figured that if he wanted something done, now he was going to have to go do it his blame self. So he decided to carry out his brilliant foolproof plan and just put his name on the paper where Michael's name was in the notes. His bullet points were: go to house on Terrell Avenue, render Jane unconscious, being that she's a very small woman, carry her into the master bedroom, fill tub with water, drop Jane in said water, use pocket knife to cut her radial artery to make it look like she did it herself. Now, after he had all the steps worked out, he figured out the details. He'd have to get to Jane's house without nobody knowing who he was, or it was him that was headed over there. So he'd need him as disguise just in case somebody happened to see him on the way. Now, then he would have to get into the house while Jane was hopefully asleep. He'd then need to put Jane back to sleep because he didn't figure that she'd be wanting to cooperate with his plan to take her out. Then he'd have to find a way to ensure that she didn't call police. Folks, this is a tale that writes itself because you just can't make this stuff up. Now, after studying on the details a little more, Kurt figured what better night to wear a disguise than Halloween because just about everybody and his brother would be wearing one. Now, that date would be perfect because it was about a week before the divorce was final. And here comes the clincher, folks. What better way to put his wife back to sleep than to use chloroform on a soaked rag? Heck, it works well in the movies, so Kurt figured that was the way to go. This guy has a degree from Columbia University, folks, and he decided to roll with the old chloroform-soaked rag trick as a major part of the murder plot that he'd dang sure better not fail at. Yeah, that's going to end well, ain't it? About a week before Halloween, Kurt went shopping at Walmart, where he walked around in a Halloween aisle looking for masks, along with so many people that he'd have to be a blame fool to buy a disguise that he intended to use in a murder plot right there in front of all of them. Well, a vampire mask that covered most of his head, and a fanny pack to haul his murder kit in later. He was headed back across the parking lot to his car, thinking everybody else in the store was a fool. Come October 31st of 2004, it was pretty warm for that time of the season, and when night came, it was a beautiful moonlit Halloween night in the Appalachian Mountains. And after the trick-or-treating was all done and the kids were home, that's when the chloroform vampire of Charlottesville worked his way over to what used to be his Terrell Avenue dream house before he screwed it all up. And I do mean screwed, folks. Now, other than being dressed up like a vampire with a fanny pack full of latex gloves, a penlight, a knife, and a jar full of chloroform that he'd mixed up from a recipe on the internet with a rag floating in it at 3 o'clock in the morning, there was pretty much nothing to see here. But it was about 3:45 in the morning when he showed up at Jane's house, and just like he thought, Jane was out like a light. Now, I can see this moron standing out in the yard now, trying to read instructions through a vampire mask and remembering to cut the power and the phone lines to the house just before going in. Now, once he got in, he took the lid off the jar, pulled out the rag, then he slid up in the master bedroom and opened the door. Jane woke up with a feeling of a wet rag over her face and had a real strong chemical odor to it. Of course, once her eyes focused, she was horrified to see a vampire standing over her with his hands holding her cloth over her nose and mouth. First thing that she could think to do was scream and fight for her life. She managed to get the cloth off of her face and take a big fresh breath, but the vampire was tall and strong, and he grabbed a pillow and started to smother her with it. And Jane might have been a small woman, but Kurt wasn't the only one who'd been hit in the weight room. She was in really good shape from that. Now, Jane worked her head around, to where she could felt the vampire's index finger on her mouth, and she tried to bite it plumb off. And once he felt his knuckle crack like a Christmas nut and a nutcracker from Jane's jaw teeth, well, he eased up a little bit. That's when she got loose and ran to the landing on the second floor. Of course, the vampire tackled her near the banister overlooking the main floor, which was about 15 feet below. Now, he punched her in the nose, which I guess was him ad-libbing from his instructions due to the unexpected complication. Now, he must have figured that he could be fluid in his plan and adapt and still overcome. Then he lifted her up and tried to throw her over the banister. She kept fighting and yelling, "I'm a mother. I have 2 kids. I've had the worst damn year of my life." Then, all of a sudden, just like somebody flipped the switch, the vampire let go and made a run for the front door. He made it and disappeared back to where he came from. Jane was injured and shaken, but still alive. She grabbed the house phone and tried to call police, but it was dead. She ran around trying to find her cell phone. It was about 10 after 4 when she found it and called 911. She told the dispatcher that there was a man wearing a vampire mask that had attacked her and then ran out the door with a chunk missing out of his finger. Now, police rolled up on her house, and Jane wasn't able to say who it was, but he was tall, white, and wearing a gray hoodie. And she made sure that they knew that she'd tried to bite his finger off, and it was probably bleeding. The police put out an APB with all of that info on it all over Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Now, it turned out that dread vampire Kurt overlooked a few things in his perfect plan. It might have been 2004, but folks had cell phones, and cutting the phone lines didn't do a whole lot of good. His bachelor pad was a few miles away from Jane's house, and he didn't figure on having to make a quick getaway and run all that far. Now, meaning that he thought that there was no way that he could fail, so he'd have plenty of time to just saunter back home, hiding evidence along the way. But, like the police always say, murder don't go like you think it's going to, or like the killer thinks it's going to, and they get all lizard-brained up. Now, when Kurt ran off in full panic mode, he ran down the city streets where he wound up on the Angus Road at the intersection of 2 of the most well-traveled roads in all of Charlottesville, which were Route 250 and Route 29. That's where a police officer saw a tall white Whack A Doodle wearing a gray hoodie, acting all nervous at about 4:30 in the morning. Yeah, that's normal, ain't it, folks? If you ever stood right there in that intersection, like I have, you realize just how caught with his hand in the cookie jar the deadhead on a mop stick was. Now, the officer, knowing what he knew, called for backup, and another police cruiser slid up along with Detective Philip Giles, who didn't go to Columbia University for his degree in catching chloroform vampires. He learned that from being an 8-year veteran of the Albemarle County Police Force. So, when he rolled up, he was considered to be in charge of whatever this messed up finger-biting attack was supposed to be. Now, they stepped up on the Nimrod and noticed, that he had specks of blood all over his hoodie and a very red, swollen finger on his right hand. Kurt figured that his best course of action was to decline to answer any questions and just keep his mouth shut. He did cooperate by handing over his fanny pack that was wrapped around his waist. He stood there looking like he didn't know whether to shit or go blind while police opened it up and searched it. Now, they found one latex glove, a pen light, a knife, and a jar of some kind of liquid that looked a whole lot like moonshine but smelled like strong chlorine. So police did what police do when they come across something like that. They called in a whole army of police to run a fine-tooth comb from where they found the deviant standing on the street corner looking like he was waiting for a bus all the way back to Charlottesville, where the Charlottesville vampire attacked Jane Crobeth. Now, it wasn't too awful long before one of them called back saying that they'd found a vampire mask that somebody apparently ripped off the face in a hurry and stuffed in a trash can along with a bit-off piece of latex glove. At that point, Kurt Crobeth was read his rights, cuffed, and stuffed into a police cruiser for his complimentary ride to the Albemarle County Jail, all of which is reserved for the folks who are under arrest. When Detective Giles went to the University of Virginia Medical Center, where Jane Crobeth was being treated for a broken nose and some bad bruises, to tell her who the Charlottesville vampire was, she was immediately worried about her 2 boys who were spending the night at Kurt's house. So police swooped over to Kurt's St. Clair Avenue bachelor pad that he called Pocahontas. Now, they found a car registered to the Dicklet parked out front, and they found a way to get in where they found both boys were good. A little bit confused as to what was going on, but they were both okay. After Jane was out of the ER and back with the boys, police, being that they were already standing in the vampire's lair, had a search warrant drew up and went about searching Kurt's whole house, and didn't take them long to find Jane's last will and testament, leaving everything to Kurt, and it was open and laid out right on his desk, like you do, in case something happens, and he wanted to have it handy and ready for the boys' sake, of course. They snatched up the deviant's computer, which they had analyzed, where they found his search for chloroform and a copy of a report filed by Officer Phil Waffle that detailed a scuffle over a car with his friend Michael Ayers. Seems that Kurt was probably fixing to deal with Michael next. He just had to get the small snag of a soon-to-be ex-wife that was getting ready to eat his lunch and leave him with a box of soda crackers and a can of sardines. That was, I guess, nothing wrong with the soda crackers and sardines, but I wouldn't want to eat them every meal for the foreseeable future and maybe the rest of my natural life. Of course, when you're the police and you're trying to get to the bottom of something like this, you need to find out all you can about what makes a man dress up like a vampire, pounce on his wife in the middle of the night, and try to kill her. So they went over and paid Mr. Ayers a visit to see what he could do, or we could tell him. Turns out that he was very serious about getting himself straightened out. He sang to the police like Jim Dandy with Black Oak, Arkansas, while they just sat there smiling. Now, he even said that he was ready and willing to testify to the whole thing. All they had to do was bring in the goose, and he'd cook it for them right there in the courtroom. While that was going on, Kurt took what money he had, I reckon before his divorce was final, and retained the services of one of the most prominent law offices in Charlottesville called St. John, Bowling, and Lawrence. I can tell you folks that with what all they had on Kurt, he probably felt that retainer come from somewhere deep in his pocket, and I mean probably all the way to the bottom. Now, he would be represented by law partner Francis Lawrence, and who would be assisted by his associate, Rhonda Quagliana. Now, who went on, I guess, to be a partner later on, because she's a partner as in the firm as of this today. Now, after taking the next few months to run over every detail of every little bit of evidence police had on the deviant, they realized that no matter how good of an attorney you are, And these folks were and still are the very best. When your client is dumb enough to do what Kurt did and leave so much evidence behind that he may as well have videotaped it and in the act and then broadcast it on YouTube. His attorneys pretty much told him that unless he copped a plea deal, it was very likely that the last thing he'd ever see while still alive was the inside of a prison cell before his lights went out for good. Come the first week of May 2005, all the lawyers did what they do when they are working on a plea deal, but by the end of the week, a deal was struck where the prosecutors would eliminate 5 of the charges against Kurt, including solicitation of murder, if the vampire pled guilty to 2 of the charges, which were attempted murder and breaking and entering with the intent to commit murder while armed with a deadly weapon. With that, or with it all being over with, but the sentencing, that was scheduled before Judge William Shelton 3 months later on August 2nd, and that would be it. Well, maybe for a normal human being, it would be it. When you're a narcissistic vampire, it's hard to take that your plan was a failure and you were caught with your pants down around your ankles and your pickle in the cookie jar. Of course, when that happens, it got to be somebody else's fault. So Kurt redid the math on his plea agreement where he figured that his attorneys weren't exactly on his level with the smarts and maybe they were a little less than the sharpest knives in the drawer. So he filed him a request to withdraw his guilty plea, and when the lawyers showed up with him on August 2nd for his sentencing hearing, Mr. Lawrence and Ms. Quagliana asked to withdraw from the representing the genius. Now, I don't expect he got a refund on sinking his own ship either. Judge Shelton must have thought that the smartest guy in the room knew what he wanted, and there just wasn't no more help that his lawyers could give him. And that aside from the fact that they were just put in a position where they could quite possibly be called as witnesses in the trial now, led to the judge granting the vampire's request. So after messing over the best attorneys that he could possibly get, he now needed to find a new lawyer. Again, the Nimrod outsmarted himself because things didn't work out like he thought they would. So, not that anybody cared because they understood that the sun really don't rise and set on Kurt's hindquarters every day. Once again, he was mad enough to bite the heads off a few 10-penny finishing nails. He put pen to paper and wrote a letter to the judge because he hadn't already said and done enough. He told the judge that the lawyers just took his case so they could make a quick buck by talking him into a plea deal, and now he had to come up with a new counsel while locked in jail. Now, he said that his attorneys had poisoned the well with other Charlottesville lawyers and that might have wanted to take his case. He requested that the judge require that another lawyer from the same law firm named Cheryl Higgins represent him. Kurt was able to finally find an attorney once the judge left that letter out of court. Now, his new lawyer was David Halberg, who managed to make it clear to the moron that no matter how good of an attorney anybody is, when a client is dumb enough to do whatever Kurt did and leave enough evidence behind that he may as well have videotaped himself in the act of doing it and broadcasted it on YouTube, the only alternative was to go with the original plea deal. Otherwise, he was very likely going to be the last thing that he ever saw would be the inside of a prison cell just before his lights went out for good. So everything that job did was for nothing. Once Kurt finally realized that he ain't going nowhere for a spell, his new lawyer went to work trying to find witnesses that could testify to try to maybe lighten Kurt's sentence a little bit, even though he probably thought that he'd sooner try to pull teeth out of a rooster. He was going to try. Now, with all of that out of the way, Kurt probably felt like he could breathe a little easier. That would be the perfect time for something else to come out of the left field and crush his hope. That would be when Jane pounced back with her own form of chloroform by filing a lawsuit against, her now ex-husband. Now, he read that she was seeking $750,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, and she'd have to wait until the criminal court case was over with before she could, bust him across the teeth with her lawsuit, but she was intending to. Jane wasn't done there. She threatened to file another lawsuit against the city of Charlottesville once she found out about Michael Ayers and what he'd reported to Officer Waffle about Kurt wanting to have her killed. That's right, folks. Michael told him all about Kurt trying to hire him to off Jane back when Kurt tried to take back the car he gave Michael. Jane was sure that the whole thing could have probably been avoided if Charlottesville police had followed up, or maybe just took a second or two out of the day and give her a call to tell her that her husband wanted her dead. I reckon that came from Michael's testimony at the preliminary hearing against Kurt when he said that they could have prevented this as well. Now, finally, on May 9th of 2006, it rolled around, and as the day of Kurt's sentencing, as a matter of fact. Now, Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Cynthia Murray forevermore shucked corn on Kurt needing to be thrown under the jail, along with his jar of chloroform, his vampire mask, and a chunk of latex glove from his bite wound, and left there from that day forward. Kurt's attorney brought 3 hours worth of witnesses and implied that Jane was at least partly to blame for the situation leading to the attempted murder of herself, probably because it takes two to tango, was his lingo there. Kurt was allowed to speak, and he waxed moonbat for way longer than pretty much anybody wanted to hear, and ended up claiming that trying to kill his wife was a cry for help. Yeah, I bet that dog's going to hunt, don't you? Once Kurt wowed him with his dizzying intellect and finally sat down, Judge Shelton announced his decision, and Kurt Krabath, the chloroform vampire of Charlottesville, was sentenced to 45 years in prison. And I'm sure that just about that time, I guess, Kurt was about to pass out. Now, the judge said with 35 years suspended. I guess that kind of brought him back a little bit. Folks, that's 10 years for breaking and entering, trying to kill somebody, and dang near pulling it off. Now, he was also ordered to pay restitution and not to have contact with his wife upon his release from prison. There, that'll learn him. So, off to the big house he goes, I guess, right? And that's it. But hold up just a minute. I'm not done yet. About 3 weeks later, Judge Shelton realized that he had made a mistake. The 45-year sentence was longer than allowed by law, which allowed a maximum of 10 years. So, let's wipe the slate clean and have a resentencing. On May 30th, Kurt was sentenced to 10 years with 3 suspended. That brought the grand total of years to 7, and it came with the possibility of parole. Now, that meant that he could be out vampiring the place up at about 5 years. Now, in 2011, believe it or not, Kurt Krabath traipsed right out the front door of the prison under parole and promptly moved to Arizona in a house owned by his parents. Believe it or not, he's changed his name to Oscar Michael Glass to try to hide from everything that he's been in trouble, and he's been in trouble at least another time. The last time I saw was when he allegedly tried to contact his boys, who are older now and want nothing to do with him, and he was court ordered to stay away from. No, folks, he didn't learn squat. But I reckon maybe we expect too much from our vampires nowadays, wouldn't you think? I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast, and don't forget to subscribe or follow us. Depends on where you're watching, on YouTube, Rumble, or Spotify. Maybe throw us a like, and don't forget to come on over to Appalachian Murder Mystery or Legend podcast group on Facebook, where we talk Appalachian or about anything else you want to talk about. I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder Mystery or Legend, and I will likely see you then.